Viktor Frankl discovered something disturbing in his clinical practice that most therapists still refuse to acknowledge. Women don't just experience depression differently than men, they experience a fundamentally different type of existential crisis that modern psychology consistently misdiagnoses and mistreats. While studying thousands of cases in post-war Vienna, Frankl observed that women's depression rarely stemmed from the chemical imbalances or cognitive distortions that dominated psychiatric theory, but from a specific form of meaning deprivation that emerges from culturally imposed role fragmentation. The women who came to his practice weren't simply sad, they were existentially erased, living lives that society had written for them, while their authentic selves slowly suffocated beneath layers of expected performance. What makes this revelation even more unsettling is that the traditional treatments offered to depressed women often deepen their existential crisis rather than resolve it, addressing symptoms while ignoring the profound meaning vacuum at the core of their suffering. This isn't about gender politics or feminism. This is about a psychological truth so uncomfortable that it challenges our entire understanding of women's mental health. What did Frankl see in his female patients that forced him to completely rethink the nature of depression itself? Share in the comments. Have you ever felt that your depression might be less about what's wrong with your brain and more about what's wrong with the life you're living? Viktor Frankl spent decades observing a pattern that haunted him long after his patients left his Vienna office. Women would arrive with all the clinical markers of major depression, the fatigue, the hopelessness, the inability to feel pleasure, but when he applied his logotherapeutic approach, asking them about meaning and purpose in their lives, something unexpected emerged. These women could articulate their roles perfectly. They were mothers, wives, daughters, professionals, caregivers. They could list their responsibilities with mechanical precision. But when Frankl asked them who they were beneath these roles, he was met with silence. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of someone who has forgotten that such a question can even be asked. This is what Frankl called role-induced existential vacuum, and he observed it overwhelmingly in women. The existential vacuum, that sense of inner emptiness and meaninglessness, manifested differently in female patients because of how society had trained them to construct identity. While men in his practice often experienced existential crisis through the loss of external achievements or purpose, women experienced it through the multiplication of imposed identities that left no room for authentic selfhood. They weren't suffering from too little purpose. They were suffering from too much prescribed purpose, none of which originated from their own existential core. Frankl noticed that depressed women in his practice rarely complained about lacking things to do. In fact, they were exhausted from doing. They managed households, raised children, maintained relationships, often held jobs, and still found time to ensure everyone else's emotional well-being. Yet despite this constant activity, they reported feeling profoundly empty, as if they were performing an elaborate play in which they had no genuine part. The depression emerged not from idleness, but from existential displacement, living at such a distance from their authentic will to meaning that they no longer recognize their own inner voice. What made this particularly insidious was how invisible it remained to traditional psychiatry. When these women sought help, they were told their neurotransmitters were imbalanced, that their thinking patterns were distorted, that they needed to practice better self-care or adjust their expectations. All of this might have been partially true, but it missed the fundamental issue Frankl identified. You cannot medicate your way out of a life that betrays your existential truth. You cannot think your way into meaning when the entire structure of your existence has been designed by external demands rather than internal calling. Frankl observed that women were uniquely vulnerable to what he termed meaning deprivation through fragmented identity. Society had taught them to find meaning exclusively through relationships and roles, as someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's employee. Each role came with a script, a set of expectations, and a promise that fulfillment would follow obedience. But Frankl recognized that meaning cannot be found through obedience to external scripts. Meaning emerges when you respond to life-specific demands with your authentic self, not when you perform predetermined roles with your constructed self. Consider the exhausted mother who comes to therapy, reporting that she feels nothing. She loves her children, She knows this intellectually, but she cannot feel it. She goes through the motions of maternal care with robotic efficiency, but inside she experiences only numbness. Traditional psychology might diagnose postpartum depression or generalized anxiety. It might prescribe medication or cognitive behavioral techniques to challenge her negative thoughts. But Frankl would ask a different question. Who were you before you became mother, wife, and household manager? What did you want from life before life told you what to want? When was the last time you made a choice that originated from your own existential ground rather than from the expectations surrounding you? These questions terrified his patients because most had no answers. They had spent so long being what others needed that they had forgotten how to want anything for themselves. And here's what Frankl understood that most clinicians missed. This forgetting isn't a symptom of depression. This forgetting is the depression. The sadness, the emptiness, the inability to feel, these are the psyche's way of protesting a life lived in existential exile from yourself. Frankl wrote in his works that the existential vacuum manifests as a feeling of meaninglessness and emptiness, but in women he observed an additional layer. The vacuum was often hidden beneath apparent purpose. A woman could be objectively purposeful, raising children, managing a career, maintaining a household, while being existentially hollow. The roles provided structure and activity, but not meaning, because meaning cannot be borrowed from external expectations. Meaning must be discovered through authentic engagement with your own unique existence. What made this particularly cruel was the guilt that accompanied it. Depressed women in Frankl's practice often felt tremendous shame about their emptiness. They had everything they were supposed to want: family, stability, respectability. So why did they feel so dead inside? This guilt became another layer of suffering because they believed their depression proved something was fundamentally wrong with them, rather than fundamentally wrong with how they had been taught to live. Frankl recognized that this wasn't a personal failing, but a cultural pathology. Society had constructed an impossible situation for women. It demanded that they find complete fulfillment through self-sacrifice and role performance, then pathologized them when this approach inevitably produced existential emptiness. The woman who felt dead inside after years of living for others wasn't sick. She was responding normally to an abnormal situation, a life structured around everyone's needs but her own. This is where Frankl's approach diverged radically from conventional treatment. He didn't try to adjust women to their circumstances or help them think more positively about their roles. Instead, he challenged them to commit what society might consider a radical act, discovering their own will to meaning independent of their prescribed roles. This didn't mean abandoning responsibilities or rejecting relationships. It meant finding the specific meaning that only they could fulfill, the particular contribution to existence that required their unique presence and authentic engagement. But here's where it becomes deeply uncomfortable. When Frankl encouraged his female patients to pursue authentic meaning, many discovered that their current life structures were fundamentally incompatible with their existential truth. The life that looked perfect from the outside, the marriage, the family structure, the social position, might be the very architecture of their depression. This created an excruciating dilemma: continue living the life that was killing them slowly, or disrupt everything in pursuit of existential authenticity. Frankl never promised this would be easy. In fact, he was quite clear that authentic living often requires tragic choices. But he was equally clear that the alternative, continued existential self-betrayal, leads not to peace but to a kind of living death. Depression wasn't the problem. Depression was the messenger, the psyche's way of saying that something profound was wrong with how you were living. What Frankl observed was that women were particularly susceptible to what he called provisional existence, living as if their real life would begin later, after the children were grown, after their husband retired, after they finished taking care of everyone else. But life is not a rehearsal. There is no later when your authentic existence finally begins. There is only now, and every moment spent in existential self-betrayal is a moment lost forever. Consider the woman at 50 who suddenly cannot get out of bed. Her children are grown and independent. Her marriage is stable. She has fulfilled every role society assigned her. And now she faces the terrifying question, What did I want? Who am I when I'm not needed? The depression that arrives at this moment isn't a chemical malfunction. It's a reckoning. It's the accumulated weight of decades of existential displacement, finally demanding attention. Frankl would tell such women that their depression contained important information. The emptiness wasn't something to medicate away, but something to listen to. It was their psyche's way of protesting years of self-abandonment, of living at such distance from their authentic will to meaning, that they no longer knew how to want anything for themselves. But listening to depression's message requires tremendous courage, because it might reveal that your entire life structure needs to change. It might reveal that the roles you've performed so faithfully have nothing to do with who you actually are. It might reveal that you've spent decades being good instead of being real, and that goodness without authenticity produces not virtue, but a special kind of death. This is why Frankl's approach was considered radical, and why many therapists still resist it. It's much easier to prescribe medication and coping strategies than to tell a woman that her depression might be the healthiest response possible to a life lived in fundamental self-betrayal. It's much easier to help her adjust to circumstances than to encourage her to question whether those circumstances should be endured at all. Frankl observed that successful treatment of women's depression required something that made his colleagues uncomfortable. It required validating the depression's essential message. The woman who felt empty wasn't defective. Her psyche was working perfectly, sending urgent signals that she was living the wrong life. The depression was the alarm, not the disease. Treating the alarm without addressing the fire it warned about was not healing. It was silencing the only mechanism she had for recognizing her existential crisis. In his works, Frankl emphasized that each person has a unique meaning to fulfill, a specific contribution that only they can make. For women in his practice, discovering this often meant confronting decades of conditioning that taught them to find meaning exclusively through serving others. It meant recognizing that while caring for others could be part of their meaning, it could not be the totality of it without producing existential collapse. You cannot build an authentic life on borrowed purposes. What does this mean practically? It means that a depressed woman must ask herself the most terrifying question possible. If I removed all the roles I perform for others, all the expectations I fulfill, all the versions of myself I've constructed to please or accommodate or maintain peace, what remains? Who am I in that empty space? For many women, the honest answer is, I don't know. And that not knowing is absolutely terrifying because they've spent their entire lives avoiding it. They've stayed busy, stayed needed, stayed useful, precisely so they wouldn't have to face that void. But Frankl understood that you cannot discover authentic meaning without first facing the void, without first acknowledging how far you've drifted from your own existential core. This process cannot be rushed or medicated away. It requires sitting with profound discomfort, with the guilt of potentially disappointing others, with the fear that your authentic self might want things that don't fit into your current life structure. It requires acknowledging that you might have spent years or decades living the wrong life, and that recognition is almost unbearably painful. But here's what Frankl discovered. Women who had the courage to face this void, who allowed themselves to genuinely not know before trying to quickly reconstruct a new identity, often emerged with a clarity about their authentic will to meaning that transformed not just their depression, but their entire existence. They discovered desires they had suppressed, talents they had neglected, callings they had ignored because they didn't fit into acceptable feminine roles. Some discovered they wanted to create art or pursue intellectual work with the same intensity they had given to raising children. Some discovered that the relationship structures they had maintained were fundamentally incompatible with their authentic selves. Some discovered that they had spent decades performing a version of womanhood that had nothing to do with who they actually were. These discoveries were not comfortable. They often created significant life disruption. Family members who had benefited from the woman's self-abandonment often reacted with hostility to her authentic emergence. Society that had praised her selflessness suddenly pathologized her self-determination. The same people who had expressed concern about her depression became uncomfortable with her aliveness, because her aliveness threatened the systems that had relied on her depletion. Frankl warned his female patients about this. He told them that existential authenticity often comes at a social cost, that others might prefer the depressed version of you who made no demands rather than the authentic version who claims her own meaning. This is one of the cruelest aspects of women's depression. Others often have an investment in your continued self-betrayal because your authenticity might disrupt arrangements that serve them. But Frankl was absolutely clear about the alternative. Continued existential self-betrayal doesn't preserve anything worth preserving. It doesn't protect relationships that require your diminishment to function. It doesn't maintain peace that depends on your silence. It produces only a living death, a gradual erosion of your capacity to feel anything at all, until you become a hollow performance of a person, going through motions that mean nothing to you. The women in Frankl's practice who recovered from depression, truly recovered, not just managed symptoms, were those who found the courage to ask what they actually wanted from their one existence, independent of what others wanted from them or for them. They were women who committed to authentic meaning even when it disappointed others, even when it required disrupting comfortable arrangements, even when it meant admitting they had spent years living the wrong life. This doesn't mean every depressed woman needs to blow up her life. But it does mean she needs to be willing to acknowledge when fundamental aspects of her life are incompatible with her existential truth. It means recognizing that some forms of depression cannot be treated without significant life changes, because the depression is a healthy response to an unhealthy situation. Before we conclude, I want to emphasize something crucial. These insights are meant for reflection and inspiration, not as a replacement for professional support. If you're struggling with depression or other psychological burdens, reaching out to qualified psychologists or psychiatrists is one of the most important and courageous steps you can take. Seeking professional help isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of profound self-care and strength. These mental health professionals can provide the support, guidance, and treatment that can help you find your path toward healing and authentic living. Frankl's insight wasn't just about women's depression. It was about the human cost of living inauthentically, of constructing an entire existence around external demands while abandoning your own will to meaning. Women simply provided the clearest example because cultural conditioning had trained them most thoroughly in existential self-abandonment. So here's what Frankl would ask you if you're a woman experiencing depression. Is your emptiness perhaps the sanest response possible to a life that has betrayed your authentic self? Is your inability to feel joy perhaps your psyche's refusal to celebrate an existence that denies your truth? Is your exhaustion perhaps not from doing too much, but from doing things that have nothing to do with who you actually are? These questions have no comfortable answers. They require a level of self-honesty that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. They might reveal that the life you've built so carefully is fundamentally wrong for you. They might demand changes that terrify you and disappoint others. They might require you to choose between continued performance and authentic existence, but consider the alternative. You can continue medicating the symptoms while ignoring the message. You can keep trying to adjust your thinking while maintaining the circumstances that make authentic thinking impossible. You can remain the good woman, the selfless woman, the woman who makes no demands and disrupts nothing. And you can watch yourself die incrementally, feeling less and less until you feel nothing at all. Or you can do what Frankl challenged his patients to do, face the terrifying void of not knowing who you are beneath your roles, and discover what meaning only you can fulfill. This path offers no guarantees. It might disrupt everything. It might cost you relationships and security and others' approval, but it offers something that continued self-betrayal never can: the possibility of feeling genuinely alive, of living from your existential core rather than from society's script, of experiencing meaning that originates from your authentic engagement with existence rather than from borrowed purposes. Frankl believed that we each have a unique meaning to fulfill, a specific contribution only we can make. For women, discovering this often means committing what feels like an act of betrayal, choosing themselves over others' needs, prioritizing their authentic development over their prescribed roles, claiming space for their own will to meaning, even when it disappoints those who benefit from their self-abandonment. But it's not betrayal. It's the opposite. Betraying yourself to maintain others' comfort is the real betrayal, the one that produces depression's special emptiness. Choosing authentic existence isn't selfishness, it's the only way to offer something real to the world rather than a hollow performance. So I'll leave you with Frankl's most challenging question. Are you living your life, or are you living the life others wrote for you? Are you pursuing your own will to meaning, or are you performing borrowed purposes that produce only emptiness? And if the answer disturbs you, if you realize you've spent years or decades in existential self-betrayal, what are you going to do about it? Because here's the truth Frankl understood, and that your depression might be trying to tell you. You have one. Existence. One brief opportunity to discover and fulfill your unique meaning. Every moment spent living inauthentically is gone forever. The depression isn't your enemy. The depression is your psyche's last desperate attempt to get your attention, to make you recognize that something is profoundly wrong with how you're living. Are you finally ready to listen?